5 enterprise thinking triangles. Before I get into them, I'd like you to just step back to the last video we had done. We talked a little bit about how awareness and knowledge are separate, and you have to kind of be able to distinguish between the two of them. And I remember while writing this, one of the articles that I had read or I had had conversations about was that during the 2008 to 2012 recession time frame, there were a lot of articles about how for every one job, there were 4 people capable or 4 people who could apply for that job. For every one job, there were 4. The challenge was, you would think, well, most people would think, well, then there's plenty of opportunity. People, the employers can find anybody they need. What ended up being the truth was there were very few applicants that could fill those roles for those new jobs. They needed computer specialists or programmers, they needed healthcare workers, people who had some type of skill set that they could deliver with them. And what they had found was this large group of people had not really been growing their skill sets, even though they had progressed over the years. So just because you've moved along in your career, just because you've made some progress and achieved another step, it doesn't mean that you've actually learned something new. You might have been able to be better politically, but you might not have brought some new skills to the table. And what I'm going to share with you here is a little bit about how you can make some of that conversion. Now, what I'd like you to think about is in this way. I'd like you to think about some of the things that you've done that you've had to put an extreme amount of energy in to learn something. The type of knowledge that it takes. So in the past year, are you that person? Did you take on a new endeavor? Did you learn about process management, project management? Did you spend the time learning a new language? Did you do something that required in-depth knowledge to be able to be successful? Most people have not. And the challenge I would throw out to you is that if you were to look at the, let's say, the leadership business books that are out there on the main tables and are publicized the most of those books are only going to give you awareness level of understanding of what to do. Now, I'm not saying that the individual who wrote it didn't have that skill set. It's often that that person doesn't know how to translate it into tools, methodologies, and approaches that is transferable between people. So what they do is they give you an overview, a big picture perspective, and it's your job to narrow it down and figure it out. That didn't mean that you gained knowledge. It just meant you read a lot of information or you engaged a lot of information. I have some friends who believe they only read academic papers because those people did the research. Well, academia, have you met some professors? They're not always that smart either. They do their own research with their own twist, and they even can prove their own hypotheses. Point is that you have to be careful sometimes even the sources that you look at. Now, one way to assess how well or if you've grown is to think of something that you have in the past done where you had to put the energy in. The time and effort it takes to learn a new language is the time and effort it takes to become knowledgeable. The time and effort that it takes to be skilled at process flow or a new application, where sometimes you'll have to work on it for weeks on end, is learning, going from awareness to knowledge. Now that's a huge jump. And you can then start to say to yourself, what are these opportunities out there? There's classrooms, there's books, there's mentors, there's experiences, there's a variety and host of other ways in which you can learn. But even within those, you might not be finding the in-depth knowledge necessary to move yourself forward. I've been to conferences, walked away and said, you know, a lot of good information, but nothing that I could utilize. I've read books, and I read a ton of books where when I was done, I said, great book, can't do it. One of my favorites is, I love the book Freakonomics with Levitt and with Dubner. They really were capable of bringing some great situations to life. The thing is, they're wired differently than I am. They see the world differently than I do. And that's not to say good or bad. I don't think I'm ever going to be a high-quality musician. I don't hear the same pitches that certain people have. I don't think I'm going to be the best connoisseur of wines. There are people who have a better palate than I do. There are people who are capable of, I'll give you an example. My wife, Lori, she sees spelling and grammar. She looks at it, a sentence is off, and it pops into her mind it's wrong. My son Adam does that. Jake does that. I don't. If an article or something I read or something I'm engaged in, if it's cognitive enough, I'll get it. But to them, these things jump off the page. I will not be wired that way. So that's not to say that these aren't good books to learn and read about. I loved reading Freakonomics. It made me aware of different styles and approaches that people had. It was valuable. Again, how are you taking the step to be able to push that back and do something differently? In my life, what I did is I started to say I'm not going to spend all the time that I'm learning on awareness-engaged activities. I'm going to go in depth. I'm going to make sure to pick certain categories and go in depth so I can use that information longer and further. Now, here are 2 tips that I'd like to throw your way. If at first you don't understand something, you may just need some time. Time for it to digest, time to mull it over. Often people don't give it enough time. The second, actually I'll give you a third. The second, which is one that's not in here, is that just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not right. Oftentimes I get people say, no, that can't be. Well, just because you don't understand physics doesn't mean it's wrong. You might have to find a certain type of teacher, a certain type of tool that'll help you to be able to learn that information better than you would in the means in which you're doing it. So for example, if you've been watching videos, you might need to sit down next to somebody. My partner in ecosystems, Jay, the way he writes his style, I don't absorb it as well as when he tells it to me. So oftentimes I'll say, no, tell it to me. Tell it to me. And that's the way I receive that information better than I would have otherwise. And the last one is, don't assume that because you can't understand something today that you won't understand it tomorrow. Often you get people giving up because it's too hard, it's too difficult, I don't get it. There's something in the brain, and I don't know how this works, where things click. So I've had students who've worked in my classes who've been for a very long period of time working on something, and then it clicks. Something came together. As a matter of fact, when we worked on these 5 triangles, or they weren't originally 5 triangles, when I was trying to figure this whole process out, I remember going to class and saying, hey, I'd like to hear your opinion. These were all international students from all over the world. What's your opinion of this tool? And there was this one woman, Oksana, who looked at it and she said, I don't get it, it doesn't make sense. And all through lunch, we sat around as a class and we looked at the tool and tried to transform it. And their information was extremely valuable and moving to this next step. So with that said, I'm hoping that just this little bit of information that I've given you so far is now shifting you from first understanding awareness, now to understanding that awareness is good in many cases, you need it, but that if you haven't driven down into that real deep understanding, you're not going to be able to get there. So I'll leave it with this. This morning I was watching, while I was working on some YouTube videos in the background, and they were having some people who've been very successful in their lives. And Jake Gyllenhaal was on there. I guess you would say he's very successful as an actor. And what he did in order to do some of his boxing movie is he lived as a boxer. So for a period of time, what he did was he learned boxing, he lived as a boxer, he wanted to make it real. And he says, unlike many other people, he got so engaged in it that made him go deeper and deeper so that he could play the role appropriately. Think about your life and the transformations you're making. How often do you spend that time going deep? So I'm going to show you how next in the actual 5 triangles.